It was just after midnight, 12:47 a.m., Iran Standard Time, when the first spark lit up a bank facade in downtown Tehran. At first, it was a single explosion, flames bursting through the glass doors of one of the city's largest financial institutions. Seconds later, all across the capital, dozens of others followed suit. Parents woke to the sound of alarms. Students abandoned sleep and raced to balconies. Market vendors stood frozen, watching fire dance across the windows of buildings once thought invulnerable. In less than an hour, more than 50 banks, from Tehran to Mashhad and Isfahan, were burning in the heart of a nationwide uprising that officials can no longer hide. This was not a protest, this was a revolt. A storm had finally broken. Iran is a nation of nearly 90 million people, but tonight, many of its most powerful insiders were no longer in Tehran. According to opposition analysts and unverified financial trackers, powerful political elites and some senior security commanders had quietly transferred billions of dollars out of the country, potentially as much as $5.2 billion, in the weeks leading up to this revolt. This capital flight was reportedly hidden through shell companies, opaque banking channels, and real estate purchases abroad, money that, in the eyes of the demonstrators, belonged to the people. Officially, Tehran refuses to acknowledge such figures, but analysts say intelligence receipts and financial migration logs point to significant outflows that accelerated just days before the nationwide chaos erupted. And as the firestorm spread through the streets, rumors swirled that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, had already activated contingency plans to flee, most likely toward Russia, should his own security forces fracture and turn on him. Sources familiar with the situation say preparations have been underway for weeks. Chaos was not born here. It was long in the making. Over the last several months, Iranians in every social class have felt the consequences of an economy in freefall. The Iranian rial plunged to record lows, squeezing ordinary families and fueling widespread discontent. The head of the central bank resigned under pressure after the currency collapse, and surging inflation left millions struggling just to buy bread. Protests, once focused on economic grievances, quickly evolved into political demands. What began as anger over rising prices now includes chants of death to Khamenei and calls for systemic change. Demonstrators have taken to the streets in more than 80 cities, many joined by students, workers, and merchants, turning this into one of the largest anti-government movements in years. By sunrise, the fires had become symbols, not just of destruction, but of defiance. The night of fire, symbolic and deliberate. From Tehran's Azadi Square to Mashhad's crowded bazaars, protesters did not merely march. In dozens of videos shared before Iran's blackout of internet services, crowds were seen marching toward institutions seen as pillars of the clerical state, banks, government offices, and even some mosques. In some cases, people carried flaming torches as they chanted slogans demanding the fall of the theocratic regime. In the beginning, it was just one bank, then two, then five, then we lost count, said one protester near Safavid Street in Isfahan. We haven't burned anything out of greed. We're burning what represents the corruption that destroyed our jobs and our future. This sentiment, shared by protesters across the nation, captures the raw emotion driving this movement. Witnesses reported that security forces initially hesitated to intervene, possibly because they were overwhelmed or uncertain about orders. But as flames grew and more institutions were targeted, riot police and paramilitary units began moving in, trying to erect defensive lines. In some districts, armored vehicles blocked off roads. In others, groups of protesters used stolen municipal barriers to secure positions of their own. Screenshots and videos from inside Tehran's Charsu district show thick smoke rising into a pink-lit dawn. Most major intersections reported traffic chaos, with buses and private cars stalled by crowds and roadblocks. Protesters used improvised shields and makeshift gear to hold positions while chanting and lighting additional fires. The cost of discontent, economic meltdown, sparks political revolt. Iran's economic distress did not arrive overnight. After decades under heavy international sanctions and a collapse of major export sectors, ordinary Iranians have found themselves hard-pressed to make ends meet. What once was political discontent quietly simmered below the surface. The rial's collapse, reaching lows that have shattered savings and destabilized markets, served as a kindling to a larger blaze. When food prices rose sharply last fall, it was only a matter of time before frustration exploded into streets and squares across the nation. Earlier in the protests, authorities tried to stem the rising tide with traditional tactics: arrests, limited concessions on subsidies, and promises of economic reform. But those efforts failed to address the deeper grievances fueling the movement. Instead, protesters widened their demands, from economic relief to political transformation and an end to decades of clerical rule. In cities across Iran, chants once reserved for public festivals now included open defiance of the supreme leader himself. Some youth activists, many of them students, publicly called for dissolving the Revolutionary Guard's political influence, while others took aim at symbols of clerical privilege. This was no longer a crowd demanding tweaks, this was a population seeking root and branch change.
Iran's Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has been in exile for nearly 50 years. His father, Iran's Shah, was so widely hated that millions took to the streets against him in 1979, forcing him from power. Now Pahlavi is trying to position himself as a player in his country's future. From exile in the United States, Pahlavi successfully spurred demonstrators onto the streets Thursday night in a massive escalation of the protests sweeping Iran. Initially sparked by the Islamic Republic's ailing economy, the demonstrations have become a serious challenge to its theocracy, battered by years of nationwide protests and a 12-day war in June launched by Israel that saw the US bomb nuclear enrichment sites. Pahlavi has issued new calls rebroadcast by Farsi-language satellite news channels and websites abroad for Iranians to return to the streets Friday night. It's still unknown how much real support the 65-year-old has in his homeland. The first term of President Donald Trump saw Pahlavi's profile rise again. Still, Trump and other world leaders have so far been hesitant.
Government response: crackdown, blackouts, and threats. Faced with rising unrest, the Iranian government resorted to hostile measures. In major cities, internet services were disrupted or completely shut down to stifle communication among protesters and limit reporting of government abuses. The nationwide blackout began in the early hours of January 8th, the authorities said, as part of national security measures. But many analysts saw it as a last resort to block information flow as protests intensified. At the same time, Iran's parliament and judiciary publicly warned of legal punishment without leniency for those involved in rioting and vandalism, drawing stark threats against anyone who defies state directives, and yet the response only seemed to inflame tensions further. Despite government warnings, at least 217 deaths have been reported in clashes between security forces and demonstrators in recent days, according to activists, human rights groups, and some international media outlets, though official figures remain disputed. Videos and photos show clashes in provincial centers and urban hubs where protesters and security forces have engaged in sustained confrontations. Hospitals have struggled to cope with growing numbers of wounded civilians. Meanwhile, paramilitary Basij forces, a core pillar of the clerical regime's enforcement apparatus, have been deployed in increasing numbers around key infrastructure, including government buildings and state banks. These units have been accused of using overwhelming force to quell the uprising. The elite exit, rumors and reality. As the unrest spread and economic instability deepened, rumors began circulating among insiders that high-ranking officials, wealthy clerics, and elite families were quietly exiting the country. Some opposition analysts claim that billions of dollars, possibly around $5.2 billion, were moved offshore or hidden in foreign assets, primarily through Russian financial networks, to secure an escape fund in case the regime's stability collapsed. This figure, widely cited among diaspora activists and foreign intelligence circles, has not been independently verified by major international press outlets, but opposition sources insist that such capital flight reflects deep fears among Iran's ruling class. Many believe that Moscow, often seen as Tehran's geopolitical ally, might serve as a refuge or staging ground should the ruling circle decide flight is safer than fighting. Reports suggest that plans for temporary sanctuary in Russia are being discussed among hardliners who fear that once elite units begin defecting or refusing orders, their safety will be at risk. Eyewitnesses in Tehran say that luxury cars with diplomatic plates have been spotted near embassies hours before the worst clashes erupted.
Overnight, protesters flooding the streets across Iran for the 14th night in a row. Masses gathering in Tehran, inundating the nation's capital as far as the eye can see. Crowds cheering around this bonfire, dancing around the flames. Chanting "Down with the dictator," blasting the regime over Iran's failing economy and soaring inflation. In this dramatic footage posted on social media, a man with what appears to be a homemade flamethrower sets a motorcyclist on fire. These protesters risking arrest and even death. The government trying to shut them down with a nationwide communications blackout, cutting off the internet, cell service, and phone lines. As the crackdown intensifies, President Trump escalating his warning to the Iranian regime.
And I tell the Iranian leaders, you better not start shooting because we'll start shooting too.
Human rights groups say dozens of protesters.
Whether these elite escape plans include such specific funds remains unconfirmed. In parts of Tehran, crowds have torn down banners of religious leaders and chanted for a new political order to replace the current system. International tension and geopolitical implications. The protests and the regime's reaction have not gone unnoticed internationally. Neighboring countries are watching closely. Europe and the United States have issued cautious warnings, urging Tehran to respect human rights while also expressing concern over increasing violence. Meanwhile, remarks from US policymakers have been met with fierce rhetoric from Iranian officials, who claim foreign powers are meddling in internal affairs and inciting unrest.
یه مش تخریبگر آمدن ساختمان متعلق به کشور خودشون رو خراب کردن. مثلا فرض کنید فلان ساختمان دیواری رو خراب کردن برای اینکه دل رئیس جمهور آمریکا خوش بود.
Iran's own parliament speaker has even warned that if foreign powers intervene militarily or escalate pressures further, Tehran may retaliate against perceived enemies, a statement that heightens fears of regional conflict. Such geopolitical tension only adds fuel to an already explosive situation. The human cost. Lives, families, and futures. Behind the statistics and strategic calculations are the human stories that rarely make international headlines. Families in provincial cities tell of loved ones shot by security forces. Young protesters speak of a future they feel slipping away. Mothers clutch photos of sons and daughters taken from demonstrations and never returned home. Hospitals struggle with limited supplies and overwhelmed emergency rooms. One memorable image that circulated before the blackout was that of a young teenager killed in a square, his school bag still at his side, a stark emblem of the generation struggling to carry the burden of a political crisis they did not choose. In impoverished neighborhoods, residents talk of unemployment, food shortages, and skyrocketing prices, daily struggles that have finally turned into nightly confrontations with tanks, batons, and tear gas. This is not a theoretical protest. It is a revolt rooted in economic pain and political frustration, one that now burns like the fires in the streets of every major city. In a nation already strained by sanctions, internal dissent, and economic collapse, the sudden eruption of fires, clashes, and potential elite flight raises a horrifying question. Is the regime unraveling or merely stretching itself thinner? If security forces begin to break ranks, if key units refuse orders, or if elite decision-makers conclude that survival outside Iran is safer than defending the state, the nation could tip into civil conflict. At that point, what once was a protest may become a power struggle between factions of the establishment itself. Some analysts believe that Iran is facing a turning point, a moment that could redefine its future, internally and geopolitically, but others warn of a brutal crackdown, civil strife, and a prolonged period of instability that could scar the nation for years. One thing is certain, this is not just another protest. This is something deeper, something bigger, and something that may rewrite the course of Iranian history.